Robert's journey to master advanced English. Robert Jones, a 25-year-old engineer, lived in a small town named Maplewood. The town was peaceful, with friendly neighbors and close-knit communities. However, there was one thing that always made Robert feel uneasy as speaking English. He was good at his job, talented in designing machines, and loved working with his hands, but when it came to communication, especially in English, Robert often found himself struggling. Even though he had learned English in school, Maplewood was a town where most people spoke their native language. There weren't many opportunities for Robert to practice speaking English in everyday life. So, as he grew older, Robert found himself avoiding situations where he had to speak English, especially in front of others. In his own words, Robert recalls, "I understood English when I read it or listened to it, but speaking was a different challenge." Whenever I had to say something in English, my mind would go blank, and I couldn't find the right words. I felt stuck. It made me feel small and embarrassed. Despite these challenges, Robert had big dreams. He wanted to work in a multinational company, travel the world, and collaborate with people from different countries. For that, he knew he had to master English, not just understand it, but speak it fluently and confidently. Robert's fear of speaking English wasn't new. It had started in his childhood. In school, he was one of the brightest students in subjects like math and science, but when it came to English class, Robert felt lost. He could write essays and understand grammar rules, but when the teacher asked him to speak in front of the class, his hands would shake. I remember the first time I had to give a presentation in English, Robert says. I stood in front of the class, holding my notes tightly, and when I opened my mouth to speak, no words came out. My classmates stared at me, waiting, and the longer I stood there in silence, the more nervous I became. I ran out of the classroom, embarrassed. This fear stayed with Robert as he grew older. When he became an engineer, he realized that his inability to speak English confidently was holding him back in his career. He avoided meetings where he had to speak English, even though he had valuable ideas to share. He felt that his career wasn't growing as fast as it could because of this. Robert says, "I knew I had to do something about it. I couldn't let my fear of speaking English stop me from achieving my dreams." But it wasn't easy. Every time I tried to practice speaking, the fear of making mistakes would stop me. I didn't want people to laugh at my accent or point out my errors. One day, after a meeting where Robert had stayed silent while his colleagues discussed important ideas, he realized he couldn't continue like this. He needed to change. That night, Robert sat down and thought deeply about what he wanted in life. I told myself enough is enough, Robert remembers. I couldn't keep hiding from my fear. I wanted to be able to express my thoughts in English confidently. I wanted to be able to speak without hesitation. I knew it was going to be hard, but I made a promise to myself that I would do whatever it takes to master English speaking. Robert started by setting small goals for himself. He knew that he couldn't become fluent overnight, but he believed that with patience and effort, he could improve. He decided to focus on speaking, as that was his biggest challenge. He says, I realized that if I wanted to speak English better, I had to stop being afraid of making mistakes. No one speaks perfectly all the time. Even native speakers make errors. What's important is learning from those mistakes and continuing to practice. The first step Robert took on his journey was to immerse himself in English as much as possible. He started watching English movies and TV shows, paying close attention to how the characters spoke. Their accents, and how they expressed emotions through words. He paused the movies and repeated lines, trying to mimic the way native speakers talked. Watching movies was fun, but it was also a great way to learn, Robert explains. I loved action movies, but I also started watching dramas and documentaries where the dialogue was more realistic. I would watch a scene and then repeat the lines until I felt comfortable saying them. It was like a daily practice session for me. In addition to movies, Robert also started reading English books. He had always enjoyed reading, but now he focused on books that were written in conversational English. He read novels, self-help books, and biographies, paying attention to how sentences were structured in real-life conversations. I found that reading helped me think in English, Robert says. When I read, I could see how words were used naturally, and it gave me ideas on how to express my thoughts better. I started thinking in English instead of translating from my native language. It made a big difference. As Robert continued to watch movies and read books, he began to feel more confident in his understanding of English. But speaking was still a challenge. He knew that to truly improve, he needed to practice speaking with real people. One evening, Robert gathered his close friends and told them about his goal. He explained how he wanted to improve his English speaking skills and asked if they would be willing to help him practice. His friends were supportive and agreed to help. We started having weekly conversations in English, Robert recalls. At first, it was awkward, and I was nervous. I made a lot of mistakes, and sometimes I struggled to keep the conversation going. But my friends were patient. They didn't laugh at my mistakes, and that gave me the courage to keep trying. Robert's friends would pick different topics for their conversations, from work-related discussions to casual talks about movies, hobbies, or world events. Each conversation helped Robert grow more comfortable with speaking English. He learned how to structure his sentences, use the right tenses, and most importantly, he learned to speak without fear. As Robert became more comfortable speaking with his friends, he wanted to challenge himself further. He joined an English-speaking club in his town, where people from different backgrounds came together to practice speaking English. This was a big step for Robert because it meant speaking in front of strangers, not just friends. I was really nervous the first time I went to the speaking club, Robert says. There were people from different countries, all trying to improve their English. I was afraid that they would judge me for my mistakes, but I quickly realized that everyone was there for the same reason, to learn and improve. The English-speaking club became a regular part of Robert's life. They held discussions on various topics, played language games, and even had debates. This gave Robert the opportunity to practice speaking in different contexts and improved his ability to think quickly in English. I learned that speaking English isn't just about knowing the words, Robert explains. It's about expressing your ideas clearly, listening to others, and responding naturally. The more I practiced, the more comfortable I became. One of the biggest lessons Robert learned on his journey was the importance of embracing mistakes. In the past, he had been afraid to speak English because he didn't want to make errors. But now, he saw mistakes as an essential part of learning. There were times when I said the wrong word or used the wrong tense, Robert admits. But instead of feeling embarrassed, I used those moments to learn. I would ask for feedback, and people would correct me. It wasn't always easy, but it was the only way to improve. Robert started keeping a journal where he wrote down new words and phrases he learned from his conversations. He would also write about the mistakes he made and how he could improve next time. This self-reflection helped him track his progress and gave him a sense of accomplishment. I realized that every mistake was a step forward, Robert says. The more mistakes I made, the more I learned. It wasn't about speaking perfectly, it was about communicating effectively. As Robert's confidence in speaking English grew, he began to apply his skills in professional settings. He started speaking up more in meetings, sharing his ideas, and asking questions. His colleagues noticed the change, and soon, Robert became more involved in discussions at work. I remember the first time I spoke confidently in a meeting, Robert recalls. We were discussing a new project, and I had some ideas that I wanted to share. Normally, I would have stayed silent, but this time, I spoke up. My ideas were well received, and it felt amazing to contribute to the conversation. Robert's newfound confidence in English also opened up new opportunities for him. He was invited to join international projects where he worked with teams from different countries. This gave him even more practice in speaking English and helped him build professional relationships around the world. Today, Robert is a fluent and confident English speaker. He no longer fears speaking in front of others or making mistakes. His journey to mastering advanced English was long and challenging, but it was also rewarding. Robert believes that anyone can achieve fluency with the right mindset, practice, and patience. In his own words, Robert says, "Learning to speak English fluently wasn't easy, but it was worth it. I've grown not just as a speaker, but also as a person. I learned that confidence comes from practice and that making mistakes is a natural part of learning. My journey isn't over, but I'm proud of how far I've come." Robert now helps others on their journey to learn English. He encourages them to practice speaking as much as possible, not to be afraid of mistakes. And to immerse themselves in the language through movies, books, and conversations. His story is a reminder that with dedication and courage, anyone can overcome their fears and become a confident English speaker. After his long journey of mastering English speaking, Robert decided to share his experiences with others who struggled with the same fears and challenges. He knew that many people, especially those from small towns or non-English speaking environments, face the same obstacles he had. He wanted to help them overcome these barriers and realize their potential. Robert started by giving talks in local community centers, sharing his story and encouraging others to begin their own English-speaking journeys. He often said, "If I can do it, anyone can." All it takes is patience, practice, and the willingness to keep going even when it feels difficult. His talks became popular, and soon he was invited to schools and universities to speak to students who were learning English. He emphasized the importance of daily practice and encouraged them to use every opportunity to speak, whether it was with friends, family, or even strangers. I always tell people that the hardest step is the first one, Robert says. Once you start, everything gets easier with time. The key is to take small steps every day and not worry too much about being perfect. Perfection isn't the goal, communication is. Realizing the power of community in learning, Robert created a local English-speaking club in Maplewood. He knew that many people, like him, had a fear of speaking in front of others, and a supportive environment could help them overcome that fear. The club started small, with just a few people who wanted to improve their English. They would meet every week, choosing different topics to discuss. Each member was encouraged to speak, and the atmosphere was friendly and supportive. Robert made sure that no one was judged for their mistakes. Instead, they were seen as opportunities to learn. I wanted to create a space where people felt safe to make mistakes, Robert explains. When you're learning a new language, mistakes are part of the process. The important thing is to keep going and not let those mistakes stop you. As word spread about the club, more people joined. Some were beginners who had just started learning English, while others were more advanced speakers looking to polish their skills. The club grew into a vibrant community where everyone supported each other, celebrated progress, and shared tips and resources for improving English. One of the things Robert realized during his own journey was that practice needed to be part of everyday life. It wasn't enough to study English for an hour or two each day. He had to immerse himself in the language. To help others do the same, Robert created a resource guide that provided simple ways to incorporate English into daily routines. The guide included tips like listening to English podcasts or audiobooks. Robert suggested that people listen to English podcasts while commuting or doing chores. This would help them get used to different accents and improve their listening skills. Speaking English at home. Robert encouraged people to speak English at home with their family or friends, even if it felt strange at first. The more they used English in casual conversations, the more natural it would become. Writing a daily journal in English, keeping a journal in English helped Robert improve his writing and organizing his thoughts in the language. He recommended this practice to everyone, suggesting they write about their day, their thoughts, or even their plans for the future. Using English in social media, Robert pointed out that social media platforms offered great opportunities to practice English. He suggested commenting on English posts, engaging in discussions, and even creating posts in English as a way to practice. With these resources, Robert wanted to show people that learning English wasn't confined to the classroom. It was something they could integrate into their everyday lives, making it both enjoyable and effective.